In the morning in Liberty, Arizona Territory, the sun rose red as blood, casting a blinding light on the dusty streets. People gathered in front of the old courthouse, where the gray-silver wooden roof creaked in the wind. They stood crowded together, but no one laughed, no one talked. The silence was heavy, as if waiting for a verdict rather than an auction. On the raised platform, the moderator's gavel rang out. An old cabin and 12 acres of land. The starting price is 12 cents. The murmurs rose and died away. No one raised a hand. No one dared. Only one man, Gideon Hale, a poor rancher with red dust on his boots, said hoarsely, 12 cents. The crowd turned. There was not envy in their eyes, but pity, as if he had tied himself to an invisible rope hanging from the cabin gate. And you, if you were standing in the crowd, witnessing that scene, what would you see in your heart? Tell me, in the comments below. Gideon left town, sitting silently on his horse. The dirt road south was rutted with weeds and gravel. On the saddle, the old saddle creaked with each step. He had nothing but a herd of skinny cows, an old Winchester, and the hope that the 12-cent cabin might be a new beginning. But the closer he got, the heavier his heart became. Ahead, through the tall grass and rotting fence, the wooden gate appeared, and hanging from it was something that made his blood run cold. Not one, but 5 bodies. 5 Apache girls, huge, broad-shouldered, long-legged, their black hair dusty, eyes half closed, breathing weak but not yet gone. The ropes tightened around their necks, leaving dark purple marks. Gideon leaped from his horse, his hand shaking as he pulled the steel knife out. A cut, then 2, 3. Their bodies fell heavily to the ground like fallen logs, sinking his knees into the dry mud. He knelt down, unwrapping the cloth from his shirt to cover the rope burns on their necks. Between his ragged breaths, a pair of eyes opened, a look of pain but also of fire. It was Nayeli, the tallest of the 5. She whispered, her English broken, "Danger. They will come back." Gideon gripped the knife, looking back at the cabin gate, where dried blood still stained the wooden beams. The 12-cent house he had just bought was not luck, but a trap set. Inside the rotten wooden cabin, the fire from the old stove flickered weakly. Black smoke seeped through the cracks in the walls, the smell of ash and blood still fresh, creating a heavy atmosphere that made the room suffocating. Gideon placed each of the giant Apache girls on the ground, covering them with the tattered blankets he had found in the old chest. 5 bodies were still trembling, breathing heavily as if they had just crawled up from the depths of hell. The firelight swept across their sunburned faces, their necks clearly marked with bruises, their lips cracked with thirst. Gideon took the leather bottle and dripped water into their dry throats. At first, they only trembled, but then their Adam's apples moved slightly, and the drops of water slid down their dry throats, bringing them back to the edge of life. Nayeli, the tallest, opened her eyes first. Her eyes were as dark as abysses, shining with fierce fire and resentment. Her throat was hoarse, but she managed a few words of crisp English. "Danger. They will come back." Gideon paused. He had heard the faint whispers of dying men, but he had never seen such a look of both anguish and pride. These were no ordinary victims. A soft groan rang out. Ahioka, the gentlest of the 5, stirred. Her huge hand closed around Gideon's, the sudden force of her grip making his fingers ache. With a ragged breath, she spoke a single word in Apache. Gideon did not understand, but there was a fragile hope in her eyes. He tore his shirt, binding the wounds, sweat dripping down his forehead. He did not know whether it was from exhaustion or from the rising fear. Gideon did not sleep that night. He sat with his back against the fire, the Winchester rifle across his knees. Whenever one of the 5 bodies stirred, the creaking of the wooden floor made him jump. Outside, the wind howled through the roof of the cabin like a demon's howl. As dawn approached, silver moonlight streamed through the crack. Gideon was startled to see the silhouette of a rider standing at the edge of the forest, his wide-brimmed hat reflecting the light. The figure stood motionless as a statue. When Gideon's eyes met his, the rider turned his horse and disappeared into the darkness. A shiver ran down his spine. Inside, Nayeli stirred again, her eyes widening, her gaze seeming to pierce Gideon. Her voice was firmer, those still hoarse. You saved us, but they will kill you too. Gideon tightened his grip on the gun. He knew that from the moment he cut that rope, his fate was tied to the fate of the 5 Apache girls. In this very 12-cent cabin, which had been supposed to be a new beginning, had now become a battlefield from which he could not retreat. As the morning light fell over Liberty, Gideon tightened his grip on his saddle and urged his horse on. In the cabin, the 5 Apache girls were still gasping for breath, their necks lightly bandaged, their lips parched with thirst. Without medicine, clean bandages, and a little food, they would not survive. The horse stopped in front of the general store. Gideon entered, the bell clanging dryly. The small room fell into an eerie silence. A few women pretended to choose fabrics, but their eyes were fixed on him. The man behind the counter, thin and with trembling hands, almost dropped his pen when he saw Gideon's dusty face. Bandages, antiseptic, some cornmeal, and dried beans. Gideon said shortly, his voice hoarse as a whetstone. The salesman packed the goods, but his eyes did not dare look directly at them. As he placed the bag on the counter, he whispered, "The cabin. Did you buy it?" Gideon paused, only nodding. Instantly, the air in the shop thickened. An old woman dropped her basket of needles and thread, and the spools of thread rolled all over the floor. No one bent down to pick them up. All eyes turned to him, full of pity and fear. The door behind him swung open. The sound of leather shoes hitting the floor was steady and decisive. A tall man entered. His wide-brimmed hat with silver rims reflected the sunlight outside, momentarily blinding the entire store. He paused, his calloused fingers resting lightly on the butt of a gun at his side. "Fletcher Knox." He introduced himself, his voice deep and resonant like solid oak. "I hear you've bought something interesting." Gideon didn't reply, just straightened his back, his eyes cold as steel. Fletcher smiled faintly, his smile devoid of warmth. He placed a leather bag on the counter. The sound of metal clanging echoed out, heavy and decisive. $500. 1,000 times more than you paid. Tonight, the cabin is mine. The store held its breath. The clerk almost dropped the glass jar he was holding. Everyone in Liberty understood. Fletcher's offer was not a choice, but an ultimatum. Gideon picked up his shopping bag, tightened the leather strap. $500 for a rotten house? He said softly, his voice hard as stone. You're not buying a cabin, you're buying silence. A flash of frost swept through the store. Fletcher cocked his head, his eyes gleaming with steel. I'm buying your wits, Hale. Keep that cabin, and you won't survive the winter. With that, he tipped his hat and walked out. The door slammed shut, leaving the store trembling in fear. Gideon took a deep breath and turned. He knew those words were not threats. They were sentences. And from that moment on, he and the 5 Apache girls in the cabin were officially in Fletcher Knox's sights. That afternoon, the Arizona sun slanted through the musty door, bathing the cabin in a pale yellow. Gideon sat at the stove, stirring a pot of old beans with a spoon. The gurgling sound was the only sound that broke the silence. Behind him, 5 huge figures stirred, breathing less labored than last night. Nayeli opened her eyes first. They were deep black, like burning coals, both fiery and buried in pain. She pushed herself up, her broad shoulders touching the low roof of the cabin. Her voice was hoarse, but clearer than the day before. You don't know what you've done, rancher. Gideon put down his spoon and turned. I know I saved your lives. Nayeli shook her head slightly. Her large hand rested on the mark on her neck, her eyes darkening. We weren't hung just to die. It was a warning. This cabin once belonged to Samuel Hartwell. The name made Gideon blink. He had heard in the tavern, Hartwell was a white trader, murdered 15 years ago, his body never found. Nayeli continued, his voice as deep as a hammer. Hartwell found the false papers. Judge William Crane and Governor Webb used a fake red seal to sell our tribe's land to the traders. He kept the evidence in this cabin, and then he disappeared. Ahioka, the gentlest, interjected softly, his voice like the wind through the leaves. They thought killing him would be the end of it. But the rumor spread. We Chief Whitehawk's 5 grandchildren were captured, hung on the gate for the whole town to see. A message. If the tribe said a word, only the bodies would hang. The cabin suddenly felt heavier than a rock. Gideon could feel the sweat rolling down his temples. He remembered the pitying eyes of the Liberty people, remembered the bag of money Fletcher Knox had left on the counter. It all matched. "So the papers are still here?" Gideon asked, his voice low. Chinoa, the sharpest of the Apache girls, nodded. "Maybe under the floor, maybe in the walls. But Fletcher and those behind him believe the evidence is there. They will not stop." Outside, the wind blew, the door creaking like a chain. Gideon looked at the 5 huge faces, bruised but still glowing with determination. He saw in them the undeniable truth. These girls were not just victims. They were living witnesses to a plot to bury the land. Nayeli looked straight into Gideon's eyes, her voice low. "You cut the rope for us. That means you wear that rope around your neck. Remember, you're in on it now." Gideon was silent. His hand tightened on the Winchester next to the stove. The 12-cent cabin, which had been a shelter, was now a burning ember, dragging him and the 5 Apache girls into a fire bigger than they had ever seen. Night fell swiftly over Arizona. A thin, knife-edge crescent moon hung in the sky, its cold light sweeping through the sparse woods. Gideon lit the fire, his eyes still glued to the narrow opening. Outside, the darkness was thick and unnaturally quiet. Nayeli sat against the wall, the bruise on her neck still deep, but her eyes burned like hot coals. Her sisters Ahioka, Tyanita, Chinoa, Dakota, though still weak, sat in a circle, listening quietly to the wind. No one spoke, but everyone understood. Fletcher would not give up after the rejection at the store. The sound of horses' hooves echoed in the distance. At first alone, then gradually, the whole ground seemed to vibrate with the rhythm of steel. Gideon inhaled sharply, his hand tightening on the Winchester. He turned to the girls. "Take these guns. Even if your hands are shaking tonight, we must stand firm." Nayeli took the Colt, her huge hand clenched as if it belonged to her. The firelight reflected in her fierce eyes, and she nodded. "If we die, at least we die fighting." A whistle sounded outside the gate, followed by a rough laugh. The flames from the torches were bright, illuminating the figures milling around the cabin fence. Fletcher was nowhere to be seen, but the smell of gunpowder, horses, and menace filled the air. "Burn them out," a voice shouted. The first torch was thrown onto the cabin roof. The fire caught the dry straw, glowing red. Gideon gritted his teeth, lifted the gun, and pulled the trigger. The explosion rang out. A bullet tore through the darkness. A man fell over the fence. The gunfire answered immediately, punching holes in the wooden walls, splinters flying. The cabin shook as if it were about to collapse. Tyanita screamed, pulled the trigger. The bullet strayed, but was enough to stop the men outside. Chinoa calmed down, aimed carefully, and fired. A scream rang out, crashing down right under the gate, the very spot where they had been hung a few days before. "Hold the line," Gideon shouted, flipping over the wooden table that had been used as a wall. Fire was blazing on the roof, black smoke billowing down, stinging the eyes. In the smoke, Dakota trembled but pulled the trigger, the bullet hitting the wooden post, sparking right next to the enemy's face. Ahioka rushed forward to help her keep her balance, her eyes filled with determination. The sound of gunfire continued, mixed with the sound of horses' hooves and shouts. Liberty's night had turned into hell. Gideon fired each shot, feeling the blood rush to his temples, but he knew there were too many of them. Nayeli sprang to her feet, towering like the shadow of a mountain. She raised the Colt, aiming straight at the man holding the torch and throwing more fire. Bang! The man fell, the torch landing right in front of the gate, the place where she had been strangled. "Enough!" her voice thundered. "We are no longer hanging corpses." For a moment, the group outside hesitated, but then the commander's roar rang out. "Go! No survivors tonight." The cabin shook under the new barrage of bullets. Gideon gritted his teeth, pulled Nayeli down, and pounded his fist on the floor. "Hold on. They haven't got us yet." In the flickering firelight, the tiny 12-cent cabin had become an impromptu fortress. 6 men, a poor rancher, and 5 giant Apache girls stood against a whole army. And that night was only the beginning. Black smoke filled the cabin roof, the acrid smell of burning wood clinging to his skin. Gideon fired the last round from his clip. the smoke swirling around his face. Outside, the screams of the mercenaries mingled with the neighing of horses like a storm of crushing steel. Naeli collapsed against the wall, her giant hands still clutching the Colt. The other sisters were exhausted, sweat and blood mixed together, but their eyes never dimmed. Gideon knew that one more attack would bring the cabin down, and everything would be consumed in a sea of fire. Just then another sound rang out. Low, deep, drawn out like distant thunder, the Apache war horn. The whole forest suddenly woke up. The thunder of horses' hooves from the east came crashing down like thunder. Torches blazed on the hillside, reflecting off the steel of spears, arrows, and the red-painted faces of dozens of cavalrymen. Fletcher Knox cursed, his voice like steel. They've brought the whole tribe. Retreat. But it was too late. From the hill, the Apache warriors charged down like desert wolves. The cheers tore through the night. The rain of rockets fell. The horses neighed madly. The mercenaries ran in panic. The spears pierced the enemy's chest. One by one the bodies fell, burying their threats in the dust. Gideon kicked open the cabin door, shouting, "Here!" A silver-haired knight, his eyes like fire, rushed forward. It was Chief Whitehawk. He jumped off his horse, wrapped his arms tightly around Naeli, his voice trembling but majestic. "My niece is still alive. Heaven has not abandoned the Apache." The 4 remaining sisters were also helped up. The other warriors knelt down, supporting their bodies with respect mixed with pain. Tonight, they had not only saved the lives of their loved ones, but also saved the honor of the tribe. Fletcher Knox whipped his horse and disappeared into the darkness with the few survivors. Before leaving, he looked back, his eyes filled with a deadly promise. This war was not over. The cabin was now reduced to smoke and ash, but inside, the fire in the hearts of 6 men still burned brightly. Gideon sank down on the steps, breathing heavily, his trembling hands gripping Winchester. He looked up at the starry sky. In that moment, he understood. From now on, his life was tied to the 5 Apache girls and the entire Whitehawk tribe. There was no turning back. Dawn cast its first rays of light through the scorched roof of the cabin. Black smoke still smoldered, ash blanketing the dirt yard. Gideon sat on the porch, his breathing still ragged from the long night, his calloused hands shaking. Inside, the 5 giant Apache girls were more carefully bandaged. The tribe's warriors brought herbal medicine, applying it to the marks on their necks, wiping away dried blood. Naeli lay against the wall, her eyes still determined, though her voice was hoarse. Last night was only the beginning. Fletcher will return, and this time he will bring more. Chief Whitehawk stood in the center of the cabin, his long silver hair falling to his shoulders, his gaze sweeping the room. "We must know what they seek here. Only by holding it can we hope to stand against Crane and Webb." Gideon nodded, his eyes landing on strange marks on the wooden floor. A square of it was darker, with an unusually tight seam. He knelt down and tapped it. A hollow sound. "Here," he whispered. 2 Apache warriors stepped forward, swinging their axes. The wood split, the black tar cracking in patches. A square hole was revealed, as deep as a mouth that had kept a secret for 15 years. Gideon reached in and pulled out an iron chest covered in dust and hard tar. When the lid swung open, the cabin held its breath. Inside were parchment papers, maps, red seals of court and government. Each page bore the familiar signatures: Judge William Crane and Governor Marcus Webb. Numbers, sums of money, and lists of land buyers stretched out like an indictment written in blood. Chenoa held a piece of paper, hissing through his teeth. "Here's the proof. They sold our land to 10, 20 different dealers. Swindled the whole town, the whole region." Ahioka placed a huge hand on Gideon's shoulder, her eyes soft but heavy. "You see, we were hung not for our sins, but for the truth." Naeli clenched the edge of the crate, his face burning with anger. "Hartwell died keeping them. Now that we're alive, we can't let this secret be buried." Gideon looked at the papers, then at Whitehawk. A rock pressed down on him. From a poor rancher who bought a cheap cabin, he now held the key to overthrowing the 2 most powerful men in Arizona territory. Outside, the morning wind blew across the prairie, carrying the scent of earth and freedom. But Gideon knew, when the secret was exposed, so would the darkness. He closed the crate, his hand as hard as steel. If they want this, they'll have to go over my dead body. The sky was high, the sun was hot across the prairie, but the air was still thick in the smoky cabin. The iron chest was open on the wooden floor, papers spread out, the red ink and signatures of Crane and Webb etched like wounds that would never heal. Chief Whitehawk folded his arms, his eyes deep. His silver hair fell to his shoulders, reflecting the flickering fire from the stove. This evidence could topple Crane and Webb. But if we hold on, their armies will come. They will not stop until this cabin, and all of us are ash. Nayeli leaned his elbows on his knees, his broad shoulders glinting in the light. They hung us from the gate to send a message. Now we must send a message back. We will no longer be silenced. Ahioka, gentler, shook her head. But what about the people of Liberty? If war breaks out, they will suffer too. The women, the children, will we drag them into the fire? Chenoa lifted a sheet of paper, her eyes shining. They have lived in fear enough. If the truth is buried any longer, this land will belong to the briber. Justice cannot be had if we remain silent. Gideon sat in the corner of the cabin, his hands clasped tightly around the Winchester. He looked at the papers, at the 5 huge, determined faces. He was just a poor rancher who had thought his life would end quietly on the barren land. But since he had cut that rope, he had entered a path with no return. "You are right," Gideon said, his voice hoarse but firm. "If we bury this secret, we are tightening the rope around our necks. I bought this cabin for 12 cents, but the real price is our lives. And I accept it." Dakota, the youngest of the 5 sisters, nodded vigorously, her eyes blazing. "If we must die, at least we'll die standing, not hanging like nameless corpses." Chief Whitehawk sighed, but his eyes burned with pride. "Then the decision is clear. We keep this iron chest, and when Crane and Webb come, they'll see. The Apaches don't bend, and a poor rancher can stand with the mighty." Outside, the desert wind whistled through the wooden gate, carrying a strange sound like the distant pounding of war drums. Gideon glanced through the crack in the door and saw a few horsemen lurking in the clearing, watching. The news must have reached Crane. He stood up, pounding a calloused hand on the chest lid. "If they want to come, let them come. This cabin will no longer be Hartwell's grave. This will be the place where justice will prevail." The cabin fell silent. Then Nayeli nodded, his eyes blazing. "Next night will be a night of blood and fire. But this time, we won't be hanging on the gate. We will stand on it." Late afternoon, the Arizona sun stretched a deep red across the prairie. The sky was rolling with dark clouds, as if foretelling an approaching storm. Gideon sat on the porch steps, Winchester across his knees, staring into the distance. Dust billowed from the horizon, as thick as the smoke of a battlefield. Nayeli stepped out, her neck still wrapped in bandages, but standing tall, her broad shoulders casting shadows on the ground. "They're here," she said, her voice low and steady as a drum. The other 4 sisters, Ioka, Tyanita, Chenoa, Dakota, followed, their eyes fixed on the horizon. Soon the sound of horses' hooves came, heavy as hammers. Hundreds of cavalry appeared, cloaks flapping, rifles gleaming in the afternoon light. Leading the way was Judge William Crane, a hulking figure with a face as hard as stone, and beside him Governor Marcus Webb, long-coated, eyes as cold as knives. They stopped in front of the cabin. The wooden gate where the 5 Apache girls had been hung still bore the marks of rope and dried blood. Crane sat up straight on his horse, his voice booming. "Gideon Hale, give up the iron box and those Indians, and you'll live. Don't let 12 cents be your grave." Gideon stepped down from the porch, the red sunlight sweeping across his tanned face. He held up a sheaf of papers from the iron box, his voice hoarse but resonant. "I have in my hands the evidence of the betrayal of the entire Arizona territory. These papers can hang you and Webb. Do you think I'll bow?" A murmur spread through the troop. Some of the horsemen glanced at each other, uneasy. They also knew that if the truth came out, they, the ones who had been tricked into buying land, would be the victims. Governor Webb tightened his grip on the reins, his voice cold. "Don't listen to him. This is rebellion. Tonight, we'll finish it all." Nayeli stepped out of the cabin, towering like a mountain in the sunset. The 4 sisters followed, forming a line. Though their wounds were bandaged, they stood tall, their eyes blazing. "You have hung us on this gate," Naeli roared. "But we live, and here too, the truth will live." An answering shout came from the troops. They pulled their guns. The clicking of cocking and cocking echoed. The air was as tense as a bowstring. Gideon took a step back, pinning Winchester. He glanced at Naeli, saw no fear in her eyes, only unwavering faith. Crane raised his hand. "Prepare to attack." The wind blew, the dust swirled, and the flag fluttered above the troops. Inside the cabin, the Apache warriors had set up wooden tables as a wall, oil-dipped arrows lined up in basins. Chief White Hawk stepped onto the porch, his voice as deep as thunder. "Today, blood will be shed, but this blood will wash away the lies." The Apache horn sounded, mingling with the sound of horses' hooves. In that moment, the prairie seemed to stop breathing. Then bang! The first shot rang out. A bullet cut through the air, lodged in the wooden gate. Immediately, the whole battlefield exploded. Gunfire, screams, horses neighing. The 12-cent cabin, once deserted, was now the center of a storm of blood and fire. Gunfire erupted, bullets tearing apart the wooden walls of the cabin. Wood splinters flew everywhere. Dust and smoke billowed. Gideon lay flat on the floor, Winchester in hand, each shot hammering into the chaos outside. Naeli stood in the doorway, her tall frame cramped by the cabin. She raised her Colt, shooting down the torch-wielding attacker. The firelight caught her dark eyes, making them glow like hot coals. "No one passes through this gate." Her voice echoed like a war drum. The other four sisters took turns at the windows. Tyanita, her hand shaking, fired shots at the figure darting through the torchlight. Ahioka and Chinoa coordinated, one loading, the other aiming, each shot chillingly accurate. Dakota, the smallest but fearless, gritted her teeth and pulled her bow, the flaming arrow flying out, piercing the enemy's powder keg. A loud bang rang out, and a group of cavalrymen were thrown from their saddles. Outside, Crane shouted, his voice rising above the sound of the guns. "Burn them all! Burn them in that cabin!" Torches flew, and the roof of the cabin was ablaze. Heat swept down, and ash fell like rain. Gideon pulled Naeli down, pinning her down to avoid the barrage of bullets. "We can't hold out much longer." But Naeli sprang to her feet, her huge shoulders throwing off the wooden panel blocking the door, standing tall in the firelight. "If we die, they'll have to look us in the eye." Chief White Hawk raised his horn and blew a long blast. The Apache bugle echoed across the prairie, and a roar filled the air. From the west, dozens more warriors charged. Fire arrows flew down, lighting up the night sky, turning the ground around the cabin into a sea of fire. The battle became a whirlwind. Rifles, arrows, screams, and the neighing of horses combined to create a deadly song. Crane spurred his horse into the gate. He raised his gun, the barrel black, aimed at Gideon. But Naeli was there. With incredible strength, she lunged forward, her huge hand slamming down, knocking the gun to the ground. Crane staggered, falling into the mud. "You hang us like carcasses," Naeli roared, her hand tightening on his collar. "Now look, who's the one shaking in fear?" In the firelight, Crane was no longer the magistrate, but a man with a bloodless face. Governor Webb, seeing Crane captured, shouted for his men to charge forward. But his ranks were in disarray. Many of the horsemen, hearing the false papers, faltered. They feared they too were pawns who had been deceived. Gideon stood amid the smoke and fire, the Winchesters firing relentlessly. Sweat, blood, and ash covered his face, but his eyes were bright. He shouted over the gunfire, "Tonight, justice is no longer in papers. It is in our hands." The Apaches roared in unison, like thunder. Webb's men broke. The horses fled in panic. The mercenaries threw down their guns and fled. Governor Webb screamed and whipped his horse, but a fiery arrow struck his saddle, forcing him to the ground. He scrambled to his feet, but the Apache encirclement had closed, the shadows of men filling the moonlight. As the flames rose to their highest point, the battle reached its climax. The 12-cent cabin where the bodies had been hung was now a fortress of truth. And in its light, Gideon and the 5 giant Apache girls stood tall, like unshakable figures. Dawn broke over the Arizona prairie after a long night of bloodshed. Ash still hung in the air, the acrid smell of burning wood and gunpowder clinging to the wind. The 12-cent cabin, its roof collapsed in chunks, its walls riddled with bullet holes, stood tall. Gideon sat on the porch steps, his calloused hands shaking slightly with exhaustion. Beside him, a Winchester lay across his knees, the barrel of his gun still smoldering. 5 giant Apache girls surrounded him, their clothes torn, their wounds hastily bandaged, but their eyes shining. They were no longer nameless hanging corpses. They were survivors now, warriors with the truth. Chief Whitehawk stepped out of the cabin, his silver hair blowing in the wind. In his hand was a sheaf of papers taken from a steel chest. He looked at Gideon, his voice deep and warm. "We'll turn them over to the feds. Justice can't be buried anymore." The bad news spread quickly. Just a week later, in Liberty Square, Judge William Crane and Governor Marcus Webb were brought before the public in chains. The people were in an uproar. Those who had bowed their heads now looked up. The truth was no longer a rumor, but a verdict. As the indictment was read, 5 Apache girls stood behind Gideon, tall and proud. The villagers whispered to them, the 5 giants, 5 mountains that would not be conquered. That afternoon, Gideon returned to the cabin. The wooden gate was still there, streaked with dried blood and old ropes. He and Naomi hung a wooden sign, hastily carved with a knife. Freedom. The wind blew, and the sign creaked, but it shone brightly in the sunlight. Naomi placed a giant hand on Gideon's shoulder. "You saved us," she said softly. "But really, you saved yourself." Gideon looked out into the distance, at the endless prairie. A strange feeling rose in his heart, not of victory, not of pride, but of peace. A poor rancher, thinking he had bought a cheap cabin to rebuild his life, had finally bought the opportunity to prove that justice could still be achieved from a small act of courage. The next night, people said, the kerosene lamp still burned in the 12-cent cabin. And as the desert wind whistled through the wooden gate, the word freedom echoed in his mind, as if to remind him, sometimes it is the most ordinary people who create great justice. The fire had died down, leaving only a few embers in the cracks of the 12-cent cabin. But if you looked closely, you would see more than ashes. On the wooden gate where the ropes had once hung, there was now a hastily carved sign. Freedom. The image lingered a place, once a symbol of fear and silence, now a mark of courage and truth. This story, with its dust and blood and the pounding of hooves on the prairie, was not just about Gideon or the 5 Apache girls who survived. It was a reminder of what happens when an ordinary man, a poor, lonely, seemingly forgotten rancher chooses to cut the rope rather than look away. Gideon had no money, no power, no defenders. The only thing he had was a choice. And that choice to side with the weak rather than the strong changed fate, exposing a web of corruption that has terrified generations. Think about your own life. How many times have you witnessed wrongdoing but remained silent because you believed what can one person change? It could be at work, in your family, or simply in front of someone who has been abandoned. Gideon's story reminds us that the rope only tightens when a good person keeps the knife in its sheath. One hand that dares to cut even if it trembles can change everything. Those 5 Apache girls, Naeli, Ahioka, Tyanita, Chenoa, and Dakota, were not just giants in size. They were giants in the way they carried buried pain, the weight of silence. But when a small ray of hope appeared, they stood up, facing the man who had hung them like a showpiece. Their courage teaches us that dignity does not depend on the eyes of others, nor is it determined by rank or power. Dignity is a fire in the heart, sometimes just waiting for a small gesture to flare up again. In the cabin bought for only 12 cents, laughed at by the whole town. Who would have thought that inside was enough evidence to overthrow the judge and the governor? Life is often like that. There are things that seem worthless that contain the seeds of justice, healing, or salvation. Sometimes you see your efforts as 12 cents, small, cheap. But do not underestimate them. When placed next to courage and integrity, they can become a guiding light for many others. Those who are listening, especially those who have gone through many storms in their lives, must have seen injustice, must have carried the scars of silence. But this story reminds us, what is easy is not always right. Gideon, with his calloused hands, found strength in choosing to protect rather than turn away. His legacy is not in cows, or dirt, or gold, it's in the quiet belief that justice is worth standing up for, even if it costs your life. So the next time you see someone hanging from the gate of your life ridiculed, isolated, despised, remember Gideon and the 5 Apache girls. And ask yourself, can I cut the rope? It might be with a word, an action, a moment. But sometimes, it's the little things that change fates. Take a moment to reflect on this story. If it touches your heart, share that warmth with someone else, someone who needs to be reminded that they're not alone. And if it touches you, consider supporting the channel with a like, a share, or a subscription. Because out there, where the guns once echoed and the red dust once decided fate, the only thing left is not land or gold. It is the voice of reason. And once that voice is raised, even the wolves will retreat.